Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail Z. Martin, and today we're talking about make sure Sammy's okay, childhood trauma in Supernatural. But before we dive in, I'd love to have my panelists introduce themselves, starting with Justine.
Hi, I'm Justine Mastin. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, as well as a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, a yoga teacher, a podcaster, and a writer. And you can pick up my newest book, Starship Therapize, Using Therapeutic Fan Fiction to Rewrite Your Life, wherever books are sold.
Yay! Travis.
Hi, my name is Travis Adams. I'm a social worker. I work at the Veterans Center in San Diego. I specialize in PTSD with combat veterans. And you can find me on Twitter at the Marine_Peer, P-E-E-R.
And Lynn.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lynn Zubernis. I'm a licensed psychologist and a professor at Winchester University. And a lot of my research is in fan psychology, the psychology of being a fan, especially around being a fan of the television show Supernatural, which I've been a fan of since the beginning. My most recent books were written with the actors of Supernatural. So that's Family Don't End with Blood and There'll Be Peace When You Are Done, which have essays from the actors and the fans of the shows talking about what a special show it's been and celebrating what its legacy is going to be for a long, long time now that it's finally off the air. Sob. You can find me on all social media at Fangasm SPN.
And I'm Gail Z. Martin and Morgan Bryce. As Gail, I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, near future, post-apocalyptic fiction, and more. And as Morgan, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. But one thing holds true with all the modern day settings is that they're places where Sam and Dean could walk in and feel right at home. And I'm also thrilled to have contributed a chapter to There'll Be Peace When You Are Done. And I run the fandom track here at Continual, as well as the fan site Supernatural TFWNC. So yes, way down the rabbit hole. So, Dean's programming starts with take care of Sammy, take care of your brother. And although Sam doesn't remember the fire, it certainly shaped his life. If we're going to talk about childhood trauma in Supernatural, I think we have to start with the Winchester brothers. And I know we've done panels on PTSD of the adults and the warriors, but when traumatic circumstances like that happen to children, how is it different than when it happens to adults? Justine?
Oh, it's so confusing for the little ones. Suddenly their reality is completely shaken. And I think this was especially hard for Dean because he was old enough to form lasting memories, and in that moment he knew something was really wrong and the house was on fire, and Papa John was saying, here, take care of your brother, and I'm sure little Dean didn't realize that was his mission for the rest of his life. But in that moment, how very scary. Where is mom? What is happening? Dad seems upset. Like, kids are very attuned to the adults around them. And it was a lot of chaos. So that I'm sure it would have been really, really scary for little kid Dean.
Travis?
Yeah, I think Justine said it really well. It was making me think about some of the episodes where they do like, oh, what if the trauma didn't happen? Like, what if their mom didn't die? And the difference in their life that happens with that. If John is alive, like in the last season, Sam is giving TED Talks on Kale, and Dean is wanted man. So, they still go down a life of crime, just not the right, or not the similar one, right? Where they're not grave robbing or vandalizing bodies to burn them. But those incidences that we see and go through as children really layer the different types of lens we look through for the rest of our lives.
Lynn?
Yeah, I mean, we know that early trauma really does kind of rewire the brain. I mean, it's a very real phenomenon, and the earlier that it happens, the earlier that rewiring happens, the more ingrained those responses become. And as Travis just said, your whole kind of internal working model from an attachment standpoint changes, and then you use that internal working model as kind of a template for understanding the world. So from then on in, all the information that you take in, all the experiences that you have are filtered through that template. So when that happens early on, there's not a lot of time for information to come in without that template in place. So it just changes the whole trajectory of development. And I think the other thing that is kind of unique about trauma for a child is that it's not just about the trauma that happens. So in this case, it's not just about the fire, it's not even just about the loss of their mother. So much of it is about, as Justine alluded to, how the people in the child's life respond to that trauma. And it was a real double whammy for Sam and Dean because they lost their mother. That would be a trauma for anyone. It was violent. They witnessed it. At least Dean did. He can remember it. But it also, that tragedy in a lot of ways took their father away from them too. So they also didn't have the adult that they needed to sit down and explain to them what was going on, reassure them they're still loved, they're still safe. The bottom just really fell out of all of that too.
Well, and they, unlike many people in real situations, they couldn't go live with grandma. They couldn't go move in with their aunt. They didn't get a substitute normal life somewhere else. They're getting dragged from pillar to post, voluntarily homeless, while John is on his crusade. So what does that lack of routine, homelessness, constantly vigilant, what are the ramifications of that for children? Because there are certainly kids who are unfortunate enough to be stuck with some of those same very circumstances in real life.
I'm so glad Lynn spoke to attachment because nothing is safe. Nowhere is safe. And it makes so much sense why, the Impala was their home. It was the only constant in their lives that was, this feels like home. This feels like what home is supposed to be. And, the research tells us that it only takes one, adult being involved in our life to aid in resilience for young folks. And so I think that's really where Uncle Bobby came in, and so probably some of the other Hunter folks, but we got to know Bobby better, where these kids were just sort of desperate for somebody to be secure, because John was so often absent, and when he was present, he wasn't kind. He wasn't reassuring. And exactly what Lynn was saying. He wasn't saying you're okay, kids. Everything's going to be fine. Like, exactly the opposite. Here is a shotgun. Everything is not fine, and I'm leaving you here in this motel where any number of beasties that we know are real could come at any time. Take care of Sammy.
Makes me think of Sam's comment about the monster under the bed, and he says, Dad took care of it. He gave me a 45. Well,
yeah. And it doesn't take long before that sense of not being safe is very vividly real to that. I just rewatched in my supernatural rewatch that I'm doing. We just watched the episode with Striga, Something Wicked. And I don't think they can be more than, maybe Sam is 4 and Dean is 8 in that. I mean, they are still absolutely tiny, and they're left, like you said, alone in a motel room where any number of things could come get them, and something does. I mean, Dean takes a break to try to be a normal child for a couple of hours as an 8-year-old. And what does he learn? just even doing that, like their dad was right, there is no safety. Something almost killed his brother during that time. So, I mean, you can, I understand John was traumatized and his focus was on, I must keep them alive. But in doing that, he made them feel so constantly unsafe. And by, going after the supernatural himself and constantly putting them in areas where there was a monster, he actually put them in danger time and time and time again.
Travis?
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned, Sam getting the gun, because he's talking to Dean, right? Right before he's like, I was scared of the dark. So you should be scared of the dark. There's things out there. You know what's out there. I think when we talked about the military podcast, and we talked about how Dean and Bobby talked about how they grew up like that. John was a drill instructor or drill sergeant, if you want to quote them improperly. But that's just how they grew up. You remember that when Bobby's throwing a ball with Dean and John calls and he yells at him for doing things that, no, kids need to know how to do this stuff too. That can really adjust how we connect to other people. And it's such a well done way that they do it here with, like, the family doesn't end in blood. Like, just because you're a hunter, you're a brother. And for that attachment style to come from where they came from is, not common from the things that I've seen and that I work with.
Mm-hmm. So John himself, though, had some childhood trauma to deal with too. When Henry disappeared, now we know what happened to Henry, but of course, John and his mother didn't. As far as they knew, he ran off in the middle of the night, went to work and never came back. And we have no idea how his mother reacted to that, whether she was nurturing or whether she had a breakdown or crawled into a bottle or dealt with it in other unhealthy ways. But I've often wondered if going into the military was John's attempt at a normal life, at getting structure. So how does having that kind of childhood trauma in his own past perhaps shape how John dealt with the boys and the new trauma? Lynn?
I mean, unfortunately, what we know about attachment is that if you have an insecure attachment yourself as a child, which John may have due to being, in his perception, abandoned by his father, and you're right, we don't know what happened to his mother after that, but if you have that kind of insecure attachment and you create your internal working model of relationships around that, you are unfortunately more likely to have an insecure attachment with your own children. Now, that can change. We can have what people call an earned secure attachment if they, put some time and energy into kind of understanding and making meaning of their past in a different way. And maybe John did some of that because his relationship with Mary clearly wasn't ideal and was troubled in some ways, we see in some episodes, but also there seemed to be some security there, but it was pretty easily shaken. So John's sort of tentative foray into secure attachments, I think, got shaken pretty easily by the events that happened with Mary. And then he went back to being really insecurely attached and very hypervigilant and preoccupied with remaining relationships with his two sons.
Travis?
Yeah, and that hypervigilance piece goes along with all the other PTSD. It's one of the 4 required symptom clusters according to the DSM. And you learn, whether it's by John's childhood and him having some of these attachment issues and giving him, not wanting people to abandon him or feel abandoned. Then you join the Marine Corps and you go to war, and then you come back and your wife is taken from you from a demon. Like, all those things are going to make you really guarded, which shows when, Dean tries to find love with Lisa, and it's very difficult, right? And even trying to connect with the son and the trauma that secondary trauma that gets passed down when they're together too. There's so much there, and they do such a good job to show these different stages throughout the whole series.
And then John's reaction to Sam going away to Stanford is really acting out that abandonment. what father wouldn't be proud of their kid getting a full ride, especially under those circumstances? But he says, never come back. Justine?
Well, I mean, John, as far as we know, had no modeling for how to repair when there is, in family therapy, we talk about attachment injury. When our connection to another person is damaged, we need to be able to repair it. And if we don't have the opportunity to repair it, it's just like this gaping wound that stays there. And John had that. And so he's got this attachment injury with his dad. And it makes complete sense that he would then say, okay, well, these kids are constantly going to be with me, even though he's so often absent. But, we tend to make strange sense of our own lives, right? And it makes so much sense that when Sammy said, I'm going to go be a lawyer, that John's like, that is unacceptable. You cannot leave our pack, because I don't know how to repair this. So if you leave, don't ever come back, because I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah, I think
Great
John
insight.
John kind of, he defined keeping his boys with him as keeping them in hunting with him. And Dean in the first season, he defines it the same way with Sam. Like, he also sees it the way John saw it, that if you walk away from the life, you're walking away from your family. Whereas most families would see it as, of course, you're still part of the family. You're just at Stanford going to college. So they see it completely differently. And I think John also, we find out later that, there were times that John went out there to check on Sam. Like, it's certainly not that he stopped loving his son, but he also saw that as, I can't protect you and keep you safe if you are not right here where I know where you are. So, he was very, very controlling. And that's what happens to some people with this insecure attachment. They can't let their children grow up. If this had played out in a more normal circumstances without hunting, they still would have had issues, I think, because John never would have been able to allow those children to really become men. I mean, he wanted to on some level. He says, Sam, I wanted you to go to college. Dean, I wanted you to have a home. But really, he can't abide that. That is just too scary for him. He can't let it happen.
Now, someone who also certainly had childhood trauma was Bobby. I mean, we got to see that flashback of his abusive father and the domestic violence in the home, and Bobby killing his father to save his mother. And yet, Bobby, in many ways, while he wasn't completely functional, still found a different path than John, at least by the time we meet him. Thoughts about that, Travis?
Yeah, I mean, that episode, Death's Door, is such an important one for this series, and it leaves a mark. And it's some of my friends' saddest of the episodes too, because of what you see, but it's also used because of the self-compassion that Bobby's able to give to Bobby, and help him process that and work through it. I think part of it is, growing up and being with his mom a little bit more gave him that reassuring attachment. And then, meeting his wife and living that life, and then having to lose her is what kind of pushed him into the hunting over the edge, and drinking more and pushing others away and kind of isolating and avoiding one of the other 4 symptom clusters of PTSD, which is kind of the glue of that whole diagnosis, really. Like, if I stop avoiding and isolating, the other things will decrease. So looking at Bobby through that lens, it wasn't his first event. And unfortunately, most people with trauma don't just have one. It's compounded. And eventually that's what takes a toll. And you see that with Bobby.
Lynn?
Yeah, I mean, I would hesitate to call Bobby, functional, or he managed to completely come out on the other end. But I kind of like that it's nuanced. I mean, I think his scars never really went away. He was also very frightened. There was that whole, we found out that his wife really wanted children, and he was absolutely terrified to have children because he knew how painful it could be to be a child, and he was probably afraid that there was a part of him that would become like his father if he had children himself. So that's another way that this kind of intergenerational trauma can play out, that people can just say, I'm not going to do that. I know how traumatic it was for me. I'm just going to avoid it. So Bobby, he did make some progress, and I think it was huge for him that he was able to reach out to Sam and Dean and be in a little bit of a parental role with them. I think it was probably easier that they weren't his own children and he wasn't with them all the time. So it was kind of baby steps into that. But I think it was good for him, and I also think it was good for them. So we see that, progress can be small. Unfortunately, most of us don't make progress that looks miraculous, but Supernatural, I think, did that in a fabulous way throughout the series. Evolution of characters was super slow over 15 years. It didn't happen like magic. It happened in the way it happens in real life. And that's slow and imperfect and partial, but it's also there, and it's good to recognize that.
Mhm. Justine?
Yeah, it's interesting when while I was listening to both you, Lynn, and Travis talking, I had a couple new ideas come up that I hadn't thought of before. So I always appreciate these conversations because we're kind of co-creating even as we're
Mhm.
talking about this, because it made me think, I wonder if part of how Bobby is more okay, and I'm using air quotes because we know he's not okay. Um, but, he was the family hero in his family. He saved his mom, and in that way saved younger him too. And so I wonder if he internalized this idea of himself as this, not a hero, because we know he wouldn't use that language about himself, but a little soldier, a little fighter, a little, trying to be
A
a hero.
protector.
A protector. There's the word. And so when he sees these innocent young children that are Sam and Dean, feel like he taps into that energy of being the protector and is able to be a little bit more like, what would I have wanted when I was a little kid?
And that whole idea of, we've talked before about how Dean was very parentified, having to take care of Sam. But at a young age, he was also taking care of John. He was stitching him up. He was fetching his liquor. He was getting him Tylenol for injuries or a hangover.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking that perhaps that protector role was also ingrained in Dean in that way.
Mm-hmm.
For
Yeah.
sure. And I think I like the use of the word protector when what you both were saying. I
Mm-hmm.
think Bobby's motivation for hunting was a little different than John's. John was very much motivated around revenge. And while part of that may have been part of what drew Bobby into it, it seemed like as the years went on, he, like Dean, was really motivated to help people. It was that saving people part of the mantra that they really related to. Sam was a little more like John in the beginning. He was protected from some of that trauma. He did not fall into the protector role because he had a protector in Dean. So he was more motivated by that revenge, like John was in the beginning. I think Sam also came around to just really wanting to help people too. But because of Bobby's and Dean's circumstances and how parentified they were as children, I think they did identify with that protector role. And people can go in multiple directions from the same experience. And certainly as therapists, we see people who go into the protector role. And I am not in any way, shape, or form saying that it's a good thing, because it can be an absolute curse for people who get stuck in that protector role and do not feel like there's any space for their own needs and expressing their own feelings. So it's also not utopia, but it's understandable from their circumstances.
Which actually Dean does express. Why is it always us? Why do I always have to give up? Why? So he does express that frustration of, I've always got to take care of everybody else. What about me? Which is entirely understandable.
It's what I deal with a lot of my clients. They're like, I got to do everything else. I got to look out for everybody else. And I have to tell them that right now is the time to be selfish and spend the time working on you, because you're going to make the world around you a little bit better. We kind of see that with Bobby when he recommends the boys go talk to Rufus and meet Rufus. even though he can't be a part of that guy's life for a while, and then they do reunite and they have their friction, understandably. But Bobby's feels sadness and remorse for things that he does, and he has that heart that kind of really brings it out. And I think that's what really connects him and Dean a lot too, because they are so close like that. It's the heart, the willingness to just keep going, pushing forward to take care of everybody around them.
Now, someone who reacts in some ways similarly and in some ways different to losing a parent is Claire. I just rewatched The Rapture. And as far as she was concerned, her father, Jimmy Novak, was taken from them. And doesn't really send her in a good direction. What thoughts do you have maybe on trauma and Claire, Lynn?
I have not seen that episode in a while. I mean, like I said, people can go in different directions. And as an adolescent, you know, the way adolescents act out bad things that happen to them is usually through rebellion. That's pretty normative. That's pretty much what Claire does. I think we kind of underestimate the really complicated trauma that Claire went through on the show, even with not just losing her father, but then having to sort of cultivate a really complex relationship with Castiel, who is in her father's body and looks like her father, but is not her father, and had not that he was not that he killed her father, but was in some way responsible for her father being dead. Wow. I mean, even most adults could not handle that kind of complicated expectation. So the fact that Claire became very rebellious, I think makes a lot of sense. It reminds me, I was just doing an episode review of Walker, Jared Padalecki's new show, and writing about Stella, who's another adolescent girl who has lost a parent and is kind of spiraling out of control and rebelling all over the place and doing things that are going to kick her in the butt and kick her family in the butt. But that's very realistic. That is often what adolescents do when they're confronted with bad things that have happened to them that they don't have any control over.
Yeah,
Justine? Oh, go ahead, Travis.
I was gonna say, like, just kind of listening to what Lynn was saying, it made me think about she loses her dad in every sense of the word, minus viewing him, but also then watches her mom, right, when she's getting drained and finds her. And then she goes to this new house with Jody, who's a cop, and trying to adjust to that. And, you know, Jody talks about the whole series of the friction between them two and how she's always trying to do her thing. And Claire's super independent. She doesn't want to depend on anybody because the two people she learned how to depend on both got taken from her early. So she isolates and kind of internalizes, like, I can take care of me, nobody else.
And that super independence is a trauma response as well, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Justine?
Yeah, I think the closest that we in the real world could experience to something like what Claire experienced is when somebody, you know, has a stroke or some other sort of neurological concern, when the person they were is no longer accessible. They are changed. They are fundamentally, profoundly changed. And it is so hard to make sense of my parent is gone, but there is my parent's body. And that, you know, I've worked with folks through that. And it's very hard, and there's so much grief. And for an adolescent, you know, as Lynn and Travis were both saying, like, they'll just kind of explode because they don't have the language, they don't have much agency as far as, you know, what can I do about this? And often we'll see teenagers wind up in therapy as a problem because what they're actually doing is jumping up and down and screaming, there's something wrong here. But everybody else is pretending it's okay. And who's really having the pathology? Is it the adolescent who's like, there's something wrong here? Or is it the adults that are like, everything's fine? Your father just gave up his mortal vessel to an angel. And now we're friends. It's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, that is kind of what happened with Claire. And that really is complicated and hard to understand and a lot to ask of a adolescent who I think was supposed to be like 16 years old or something
Yeah.
like that. Also, that I had sort of forgotten about that episode where her mother is killed because I don't ever want to watch it again because I think that's actually one of the most sad and devastating episodes of the show. That episode was just heartbreaking. So well done, but absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah, and in the Rapture, she looks like she's more like about 10. She looks a lot younger when Castiel actually tries to take her, and Jimmy says, no, 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 leave her, take me. And she witnesses all of that at an even younger age. So yeah, there's a lot on that plate. Speaking of which, let's talk about Kevin.
Oh, Kevin.
Travis?
There's so much there. You know, because he was doing well, and then his life completely shifted, and he became a prophet. And then his mom, and losing her, and the boys lying to him constantly, and him feeling like he's going crazy because he's isolated and alone, and trying to make sense of these tablets. There's so much behind his self, right? Because he's this A+ student doing really well, all the pressure from his mom as he's going forward, and then to everything just to shift in one day, and his whole life completely changed. And he gets more relaxed, you can see that, and he looks more at peace, but it's such a huge shift for him. He doesn't really know how to control it as well, so it's hard.
Justine?
Yeah, what comes up for me around Kevin is, and I love the boys. I want to be super clear that I love the boys, and they're not always the most compassionate with other humans, especially when it comes to the mission. Right? And Kevin really needed some TLC around this new information about himself, and more what he got was a lot of gaslighting. Uh, of no, well, nope, this is your new life, you need to translate those tablets for us, now you live on a houseboat, here are some hot dogs, like uh, and he just I think Kevin could have come out of this healthier if, and I know it's always the apocalypse, there's no time for this, but if we could have spent a little bit of time like introducing Kevin to this new role and what it means and giving him time to integrate it, he might have come out of it better.
Well, and he lost his girlfriend too. She was murdered by the demons. So,
wow,
poor kid.
I completely forgot about that.
The poor kid had his life planned out, and he thought he knew every step of the way, but it was a plan. And then it went down in flames. Lynn?
I mean, I think it's a great metaphor for, unfortunately, how trauma and loss really happens. We all have our lives planned out. We hope, we try to a certain extent, and then something happens that you have absolutely no control over, and it's unfair and it's unexpected and it changes your entire life and it just knocks your feet out from under you. It's why people have so much trouble making meaning of these kind of big traumatic events, because it's almost like it's so out of the blue that you can't integrate it into the rest of your life. It's just like, this can't have happened. I really think the way it happened with Kevin is a great example of that. And it's almost like I hadn't thought of this before, but speaking of what Justine said about how his relationship with the Winchesters was, I mean, this was a kid who had experienced tremendous pressure his whole life, like academic pressure, play the cello, get all A's, get into the right school. He was wound super tight. What happens when he's in his new role? Pressure, 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 pressure. Translate this tablet, do it perfectly, do it now. The apocalypse is going to happen. I mean, the poor kid just couldn't get a break. He went from one pressure cooker environment to another, even more pressure cooker environment.
Yeah, because then he became like a surrogate Bobby too, right? Like the boys call him like, "Hey, here's our supervisor, the FBI agent supervisor," and they're like, So he just comes up with stuff right off the top, and he just keeps they use him and use him and use him. And one thing you said, Gail, is like we all have a plan, and it reminds me of Mike Tyson's quote: "Everybody has a plan until you punch in the mouth." And Kevin got punched in the mouth pretty hard.
Multiple times.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Jack was not your typical adolescent. I'm not sure how much the rules apply to him, but he certainly did have a lot of family drama going on. So, and he was written to be, at least in his human form, a teenager. So, any thoughts on childhood trauma to take from? Okay, we probably don't have a lot of Nephilim out there, but in case any are watching and are looking for some tips. Lynn?
Oh, I feel for Jack, but wow, what a talk about being born into difficult circumstances. I mean, terrible guilt from the moment he was born because his birth killed his mother. So, that he had an incredible longing for his mother throughout his entire life, which was part of why he bonded with Mary, which made it extra tragic that he didn't intend to kill her either, but he ended up killing his actual mother and his surrogate mother figure, which is just horrifying. And then, he was very vulnerable to his father, Lucifer's influence, I think, because I was just writing about this with Walker too. When a child loses one parent, they really want to cling on to that other parent and don't want to lose that parent, even if, like Lucifer, they are a more manipulative than loving parent. Same with Trevor in Walker, kind of has a dad who probably loves him, but is super manipulative and a criminal at the same time. But it's really hard to ask a child to voluntarily break the bond with the remaining parent. So it makes them really vulnerable to that parent's influence. And that's what happened with Jack for a while. And multiple traumas in having to realize, oh, I have to actually write off my remaining parent because he's a horrible, not person, but a horrible being who's trying to do horrible things. And I think his relationship with Sam, Dean, and Castiel was also very complicated and very fraught. At different times, they seemed to accept him, but they were also afraid of him, and he was different from them and very aware of his difference. And at sometimes they were not accepting at all, and certainly were understandably enraged by his taking their mother from them again, which was a repeat of their trauma. So what a setup. Like, how can you get around that without a lot of angst going on?
Travis?
Yeah. It makes me think about like everything Lynn just said. Lends me back to like Dean letting him drive baby and how he really does care about him despite what's going on, what he is. And he calls him a brother at the end. He's one of them. Yeah, Castiel's always trying to do that surrogate dad thing and always trying to like, no, I know better. He wouldn't do this on purpose. He lost control and kind of giving him outs. And Jack is kind of running from it for a while and trying to avoid facing what he did. But then when he does, the boys or Dean at least tries to lock him away, busts out, they build up their relationship back. And there's just so much back and forth with them, but it really comes down to like when they start talking, when he takes the responsibility, that personal responsibility for something that he was a part of, and he accepts what he did and he apologizes and asks for forgiveness, he's brought back into the fold.
Justine?
Talk about growing up too fast, huh? Which, I mean, that was fun. And also, it is such a good metaphor. Here is this child that came into this system that is so complicated and fraught. And that child had to go from being a baby to being late teenager, 20 something. I love the moment when Dean's like, "Are you old enough to drink? Here's a beer." I just like we like, okay, so none of us know how old he's supposed to be. Um, that feeling happens in families in real life when, not from a baby, but from a very young age, being like, okay, I need to be grown up. I'm not allowed to be a baby. I can't. There's no room for me to be a baby here. There's no space for the kind of caretaking that I need. And doubly hard that, mom died and we've got the guilt around that. And dad is this infamous character, which again happens in real life. Children of serial killers exist. And it can be very hard for those folks to make sense of themselves and for other people to trust them. Like, oh, you're so-and-so's kid? Is that genetic? Right? And Jack experienced that too. Initially Dean was like, we cannot have the child of Lucifer here. This is what are you doing? What are you talking about? And I thought it was such a fun way to play with nature versus nurture. Because really Jack is a powerful being. He's not inherently evil. He is powerful. And what if we expose him to some secure enough attachments? The boys aren't so skilled at that, but, secure enough. And I think, the Castiel being stepdad as this adult that aids in resilience was really helpful for Jack. And why we didn't wind up with super evil Jack. We wound up with New God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, none of them were super good at it, but luckily there were three of them. And when the three of them all put their dad skills together, they managed to be a good enough parent for Jack, I think.
Three men and a baby.
Yeah, it took three.
I would have loved to have seen more of Adam before he died. Because he had a secure attachment with his mother. John wasn't around, but John still came by. He had a presence. And it would have been interesting to see the less screwed up Winchester from that situation. But, of course, by the time we met him, he was a ghoul. So that doesn't really count. Speaking of cautionary tales, we have Max Miller. And Sam says, that could have been us if Dad had had a little more tequila and a little less hunting. Thoughts on when it goes wrong and it doesn't go the way it should? Travis?
Yeah, I think that should statement is kind of the piece that stops me a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we have this preconceived notion of how things should be and they don't hit that mark, it brings you down no matter what. A lot of people struggle with that. So, what should be for growing up for Sam, Dean, any of the other children throughout the series, what that looks like. It's not what we think it is, and it's not what, Sam wants it to be, or Max, or anybody. And so they struggle with that going back and forth, and then other people see them and struggle with it as well. I think that when they're like, okay, this is how my life is supposed to be, right? Or should be, and then it doesn't hit that adds more layers or more filters onto the way they see things about themselves and about the world around them. So it's that, and I think that's what plays a part in all the kids and,
Mm-hmm.
and all people who grow up in this supernatural world, is that they all have this belief of what they're supposed to be doing, what they should be doing, what their parents tell them they're supposed to be, and never really having that autonomy to do it themselves.
Well, and of course, Max had that augmented by having a violent father and uncle and a mother who didn't or couldn't stand up for him. And in that way, he was primed to kind of go like Bobby, off on everybody who hurt him because he didn't have a champion. Lynn?
I mean, that's an example of the kind of client in real life that just, that I'm never going to forget about, because sometimes in reality, kids are innocently born into these horrible circumstances, and are terribly abused like he was throughout his entire life, and nobody stuck up for him. And his mother died, his stepmother didn't care to stand up for him. And he had no one on his side, no one. And his life ended tragically. I mean, first he went on a revenge spree, and then he ended up killing himself. And sometimes that's the tragic way that things go, because there's no one who ever was able to intervene in time to give this child what they needed. I mean, I think you can see how painful Sam finds it to sit down with him and listen to his story and get some understanding. And Sam tries so hard to get through to him and to say, you don't need to do this, we'll help you. Like, finally there is someone who believes in you and is willing to help you. But it was just too late. And I don't like ever believe, as a therapist, I think I don't ever want to believe that it's too late, because I think if the circumstances are right, it isn't too late. Like, there's always that hope. But in that case, for Max, in that particular circumstance, it was too late. And that's really tragic.
Mhm. Justine?
Oh, I'm sitting here feeling so many feelings. Yeah, it is so hard when you're sitting across from someone who has experienced almost nothing but pain in their life, you know? And in most cases, there's still something. There's some reason to stay on the mortal plane, right? And this is something that I love about supernatural fandom, is the fandom's willingness to go there and talk about major depression and the impact of PTSD and what can happen inside our brains and bodies. And that if you have had just a terrible run of it, for some people, what keeps them around is Sam and Dean, is these characters. And I mentioned earlier that, you know, studies tell us that it just takes one adult to aid in resilience. It's my bias. I believe that fictional characters can do that too, right? Mm-hmm. Our fandom attachments can be that attachment that we need. And so that's something that I talk to clients about when they feel like everything is hopeless. Like, well, what's a story where things don't feel as hopeless?
And I think coming back to that hope, like you said, kind of circles around. For as difficult and dark as Supernatural can be, and as rough a time as the characters have it, on the whole, there's hope. There is that light at the end of the tunnel that isn't hellfire, and that we do see in the end that it can work out. Well, folks, we are at the end of our time. It goes so fast, but thank you so much. And let's go around quickly and let everybody know where they can find you online, starting with Lynn.
You can find me on all social media at Fangasm SPN, and you can find the books that are written by the supernatural actors at the website peacewhenyouaredone.com.
Travis?
You can find me on Twitter at the Marine_Peer, PEER, and I contribute to the Pop Culture Psychology books by Sterling.
And Justine?
You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Mind Body Fandom, because I take a holistic approach to healing, mind, body, and fandom. You can also find me at the Starship Therapies website. That's Therapies with an S, just like the Enterprise. And you can pick up Starship Therapies using therapeutic fan fiction to rewrite your life wherever books are sold.
You can find me at galesmartin.com, morganbryce.com, social media's variations of all of that. Of course, most of the time you can find me here on Continual. Well, thank all of you so much for a wonderful discussion, as always. And thanks to you for watching and listening. There'll be more Supernatural coming up soon here on Continual, so we'll see you online.